All right, part 2 of chapter 4. In your textbook, you have some examples of unintentional and intentional injuries. Some of these are obvious. What I want to focus on here are the asphyxia injuries. Asphyxiation is a failure of cells to receive oxygen or use it, even if it makes its way to a cell. So starting with suffocation, this is when oxygen fails to get to the blood. A person can suffocate if he or she is trapped in an enclosed space and all the oxygen runs out. Your textbook gives an example of a child being stuck in an abandoned refrigerator or a plastic bag over a person's head. Choking, having a physical item blocking the airway, can lead to suffocation. Strangulation is a loss of blood flow to the brain. It is caused by an external pressure being applied to the neck of a person, which can be caused by the individual or a malicious act of some sort. Chemical asphyxiants, all right. Carbon monoxide is the most common, and that blocks the utilization of oxygen, even though oxygen may be present. The next one that we're going to talk about, and the last one, is drowning. Drowning pulls water into the lungs and blocks the movement of oxygen from the air to pass through the alveolar membranes to the red blood cells. One actually does not need to bring a lot of water into the lungs to cause damage, either as a direct result of the water present in the lungs or the inflammation that will follow, leading to hypoxic conditions becoming worse. So if you remember figure 410 and how hypoxia and inflammation go hand in hand. One story that I heard from a reliable source about a small child who drowned while taking an afternoon nap. This is a very sad situation, or it was. The young boy, probably 2 or 3 years old, was with his grandmother, and it was already hot enough during the morning time for him to go and play in the small kiddie pool that his grandmother had. He played and had a good time and was ready for the afternoon nap. His grandmother never left him alone, but what she did not realize that every time he coughed or gagged when he was pulling water, just a small amount of fluid into his lungs. He did this enough so that he pulled measurable fluid into his lungs, but his grandmother did not realize that, and that he would be fine. He laid down for his nap, and in the horizontal position, the fluid in his lungs was able to basically thin out and cover a large surface area in his lungs, and he died in his sleep in his bed due to what's called a dry drowning. I tell this story in class every year, and a couple of years ago a student stopped and said the place where her son had swim lessons at had a 2-gag rule. If you gagged 2 times, you had to get out of the pool for the day. She asked, "Is that why?" My response was, absolutely. You have to take care of the little ones and be aware of when danger is waiting, even if it doesn't seem like it might be. All right, now manifestations of cellular injury. So we're talking about the individual cells. Cellular accumulations can be either normal substances or it can be abnormal. If we start with water, an increase in water concentration creates cellular swelling, and this is actually the most common form of degenerative damage or change. Certain metabolites can cause accumulations, and these can be lipids and carbohydrates. These can be due to different metabolic disorders. While nearly any cell can be at risk for this, cells of the central nervous system, the spleen, the liver, and the heart is where it's most often found, where you have lipids and carbohydrates accumulating. Now, glycogen. Glycogen is a source of glucose. Issues develop with the metabolism of it or the use of glucose. This results in vacuolation and is the most commonly seen in diabetes. Because glucose is needed for ATP synthesis, these glycogen storage diseases, as they can sometimes be called, often have muscular manifestations, and we will look at a couple of these diseases at the end of the semester in chapters 39 and 40. The last cellular component we're going to talk about are proteins. And when protein levels get high in cells, cells try to digest and get rid of the excessive proteins. And in the process of digesting the proteins, toxic metabolites accumulate and can cause damage. Excessive amounts of proteins within the cytoplasm can put stress on the normal function of the cellular organelles. So, hydrophobic degeneration. This figure is figure 424, and it shows what occurs when the cell accumulates too much water. It can be called hydrophobic regeneration or also oncosis. Oncosis is probably the most current proper form or terminology. On the left, you can see a step-by-step diagram of what occurs after a cell incurs an injury. And in this example, it's hypoxia. The major factor resulting in death is due to the sodium and potassium imbalances, because that directly affects how water movement is managed or unmanaged. And we'll talk about this in Chapter 5. The cell undergoes extreme vacuolation and degenerates or degrades due to the water hydrophobic levels. Necrosis, cellular death. This process in some circles is thought to be unregulated, but recent research is revealing evidence that it still may be regulated at some levels. So necrosis is the sum of cellular changes after local cell death and the processes of cellular autodigestion. And that autodigestion is important. So the process of necrosis shows a rapid loss of the plasma membrane structure, swelling of cellular organelles, dysfunction of the mitochondria. The cell will simply break open and release all of its cellular material into the environment. That damages cells around it, and the process continues for more destruction. So there are 6 types of necrosis listed in your textbook, and we will look over 5 of them because 5 and 6 kind of go hand in hand with each other. The first is coagulative necrosis. This is generally caused by severe ischemia or hypoxia from cellular injury. And the main form of protein, or the issue, is protein coagulation. And the main protein that is involved is albumin. And this is a major plasma protein, in addition to your antibodies. But albumin is a major player in this process. Albumin is also a major protein that is found in egg whites. And you can think about this coagulative necrosis process of what happens when you take an egg white and it's nice and clear in a bowl. You put it in a hot pan, and the protein will start to coagulate through the process of degradation of the amino acids. Albumin is normally transparent and gelatinous, but it turns to be a firm and opaque nature. To have a firm and opaque nature, you can kind of see that through this tissue here. This is probably fat or lipid accumulations, but you can see that the white material in the slide here, or in the picture, the tissue section. So from its name, you know that the protein coagulates and no longer functions properly. The next is liquefatic necrosis, and this is probably my favorite. Well, almost my favorite, sorry. This type of necrosis is going to occur in the brain primarily, and it's where the term wet brain comes from. As brain cells are damaged, they open and release enzymes, these hydrolytic enzymes, that then begin to degrade more cells, which open and degrade more cells, and the process continues. This is the reason why brain injuries are so concerning, and why a person who sustains a brain injury, even what might seem like a simple minor bump to the head, needs to be monitored to make sure the damage is not spreading. And in this picture, you can see a lot of degradation of the brain tissue. All right, caseous necrosis. This really might be my favorite. Caseous necrosis has a cheese-like appearance, cottage cheese consistency, or what you can see here in this tissue section. All this white material is caseous necrosis. Lungs are a very common location for this type of necrosis. Dead cells disintegrate, but the debris is left behind, which induces an inflammatory response. And then you have dead tissue, the immune response comes in to try to clear it up, and you create these tubercles. And that's what happens in TB infections. But in reality, this caseous necrosis is going to be a combination of coagulative and liquefatic necrosis. That's why you get the cheese curdling-like activity. Fat necrosis. This occurs primarily in breast tissue, the pancreas, and other abdominal organs, and it's due to the actions of lipases. The lipids break down triglycerides. You have free fatty acids that are released and combine with ions to form soap-like molecules, and that simply causes damage within the tissue. Now, of course, we all hope to lose some fat, but losing fat, you don't want to do it through fat necrosis, but rather burn it off through physical activity. All right. Necrosis can also be called gangrenous and sometimes gas gangrene. This is figure 431, and this is due to death of tissue from severe hypoxia injury. You can have two different forms. You can have dry gangrenous necrosis, and that's generally coagulative in nature. You can have wet gangrenous necrosis, and that's going to be liquefatic. And generally, if it's wet, it's going to be obviously slimy or pussy, and that is due to neutrophil infiltration. So gas gangrene develops with infection, typically by Clostridium. Bacteria produce gas as a byproduct of metabolism. The bacteria produce hydrolytic enzymes and toxins. This can cause the body to go into shock. And when you have gas gangrene, that's typically going to be with a Clostridium infection because the bacteria produce gas and it stinks very badly. Now, what this figure shows are 5 different forms of gangrene. We'll cover these different forms, except for the foot example, later in the semester when we get to the digestive tract. But just ponder on these pictures. All right, realize some of the different ways you can have hypoxic or ischemic events developing. All right, all of these issues are caused by lack of oxygen. This foot example could be an infection, possibly stubbing a toe and accidentally inoculating it with bacteria that then cause an infection. Necrosis is death of the tissue, and you've got the black color here because often that's what tissue turns into, is just black, nasty waste. The last slide here is a diagram comparing apoptosis with necrosis. This figure here that you see is an older edition, but I like it because in the middle it shows what is happening at the tissue level. With necrosis, you have widespread death of cells, while in apoptosis, you have just one cell that needs to go away quietly. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. It affects scattered single cells. It's an active process of self-destruction that your body wants to do. In this figure, you can see that with apoptosis, the cell shrinks by apoptotic bodies budding from a cell. The apoptotic bodies keep the damaging cellular material contained so as to not allow death to the cells around it. Macrophage will then come in and engulf them and properly degrade them. In general apoptosis, the cells will shrink, and in necrosis, the cells will swell. You may have a short set of matching type questions where you might need to know certain statements, or if a statement pertains to apoptosis or to necrosis. And that concludes Chapter 4.